The ink pot tipped, and Ophelia Hartley watched 400 years of vampire law drown in black. Time stuttered. The marriage decree vellum, smooth as skin, lettering precise as prayer, disappeared beneath a spreading pool of oak gall ink. Around her, the assembled court of the Viennese coven froze. 200 vampires in their finest evening wear, pale as marble statues, white hair gleaming under chandeliers that had once lit Mozart's concerts. Every face turned toward the dais where she stood, quill still raised, elbow still extended from where it had caught the ceramic rim. The vampire king looked at her. Really looked, for the first time since she'd been summoned from the ink room 3 floors below to perform the ceremonial transcription. His eyes were the color of winter fog, and his expression was utterly, terrifyingly unreadable. Ophelia's heart hammered against her ribs. She was going to die. She was absolutely going to die, and it would probably be slow, and they'd make an example of her, and Mrs. Ashford would have to find a new calligrapher, and the house cat would eat her leftover cheese. "Well," King Soren Hael said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade through silk, "that's unfortunate." The understatement was so profound that Ophelia almost laughed. Would have laughed if her throat hadn't been completely closed with terror. The ink was still spreading, dripping off the edge of the table onto the Persian rug that was older than most countries. The decree, the one that would bind House Hael to House Corvus, ending a century of territorial disputes, was utterly, completely ruined. "Your Majesty," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. He held up one pale hand, and she fell silent. He rose from his throne, and the movement was so fluid it looked like water flowing upward. Everything about him was sharp edges and controlled power, the cut of his black coat, the angle of his jaw, the precise way his white hair fell to his shoulders. He descended the 3 steps from the dais and walked to the table, looking down at the ruined document with an expression of mild curiosity. Behind him, the court remained frozen. Ophelia could see Lord Matthias Corvus, father of the intended bride, his face twisted with fury barely contained. Lady Isolde Corvus, the bride herself, looked more thoughtful than upset. The elders of House Hael stood in a cluster to the left, ancient vampires who remembered when Vienna had been a Roman garrison, their expressions ranging from shock to calculation. Soren reached down and lifted the corner of the vellum. Ink poured off it like a waterfall. The carefully illuminated initial O for "on this night of binding" was nothing but a black smear. Weeks of work. Weeks of grinding pigments, preparing vellum, practicing the precise court hand required for legal documents that would last centuries. "The decree must be witnessed and signed before dawn," Lord Corvus said, his voice tight. "Those were the terms. We have less than 2 hours." "Must it?" Soren said, still studying the ruined vellum. He sounded genuinely interested, as if this were an intellectual puzzle rather than a diplomatic catastrophe. "I confess, Matthias, I'm uncertain whether a document that no longer exists can be said to have binding temporal requirements." "Don't play word games with me, boy." Lord Corvus took a step forward, and several of his house moved with him. "4 generations we've negotiated this union. The ink may be spilled, but the agreement stands. You'll sign a fresh copy, or... Soren's voice didn't rise, but something in it made Ophelia's skin prickle. He set down the vellum and turned to face Lord Corvus fully. "Please, finish that sentence. I find myself unexpectedly curious about what threat you imagine follows that conjunction." The silence that fell was different from before. This one had teeth. Lord Corvus's jaw worked. Around him, his supporters shifted. House Corvus was powerful, old, wealthy. But Soren Hael had been king of the Viennese coven for 3 centuries, and you didn't hold that position by being weak. "The agreement stands," Lord Corvus finally repeated, but his voice had lost its edge. "A new decree can be written." "Can it?" Soren looked at Ophelia for the first time since approaching the table. His eyes were lighter up close, gray threaded with silver. "Miss Hartley, how long did this particular decree require?" Her mouth was dry. 6 weeks, Your Majesty. The vellum must be prepared, scraped, stretched. The oak gall ink for legal documents takes time to brew properly, and the recipe is specific to the age of the document. The expected duration of binding. 6 weeks, Soren repeated, turning back to Lord Corvus. And the specific language was negotiated over how long? 4 months, one of the House Hael elders said quietly. Lady Severin, ancient as stone, her white hair coiled in elaborate braids. Every word debated, every clause examined. So we cannot simply produce another copy, Soren said. Not before dawn, not before next week, not without undertaking the entire process again. He smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had just found an unexpected gift. Gentlemen, ladies, it seems we are released from our obligations by an act of what shall we call it? Fate? Divine intervention? Clumsiness, Lord Corvus snarled. Mortal incompetence. That girl should be careful. The single word from Soren stopped Lord Corvus mid-sentence. Miss Hartley is under my household's protection. She serves at my pleasure. Any suggestion regarding her punishment will be treated as a suggestion regarding the governance of my own house. He paused. I'm sure you would not presume to make such suggestions. Ophelia's knees felt weak. He was protecting her. Why was he protecting her? The girl is irrelevant, Lord Corvus said, though his eyes flicked to Ophelia with pure venom. The agreement is void, Soren said cheerfully, by circumstance beyond our control, unless you'd like to argue that I deliberately arranged for my calligrapher to destroy the document. That seems a rather convoluted strategy, even for vampire politics. Lady Isolde Corvus stepped forward. She was beautiful in the way all old vampires were beautiful, perfect and cold and slightly unreal. Her white blonde hair fell like a waterfall down her back, and her gown was the color of fresh blood. Father, she said quietly, perhaps we should discuss this privately. There's nothing to discuss, he snapped. 3 centuries of territorial rights hang on this union. 3 centuries of territorial disputes that neither house has managed to resolve through any other means, Lady Severin interjected. Perhaps that should tell us something about the likelihood of resolving them through matrimony. The court was starting to fracture into murmured conversations. Ophelia stood frozen by the table, still holding her quill, trying to understand what was happening. The marriage decree had been the talk of the household for months. King Soren binding himself to Lady Isolde, uniting 2 of the most powerful vampire houses in Europe. It was supposed to be inevitable, already decided, just waiting for the ceremonial signing. And she'd destroyed it. Miss Hartley. Soren's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. A question, if you would. She nearly dropped the quill. Your Majesty? The ink you used, oak gall, you said, ground from galls harvested when? Last autumn, Your Majesty. October, specifically. The tannin content is highest then, and for legal documents, the permanence and the vellum? Calfskin, prepared in January, soaked in lime, scraped, stretched on frames. It needs 4 months to reach the proper suppleness for court documents. So to recreate this decree would require not only time, but also materials that cannot be rushed or substituted. Yes, Your Majesty. Where was he going with this? He turned to the assembled court. It seems to me, he said, his voice carrying easily through the vast hall, that we have been given an unexpected opportunity. The decree is destroyed. To recreate it will take, what did you say, Miss Hartley? 6 weeks minimum? For the transcription itself, Your Majesty. If the language has already been finalized. But it hasn't, Lady Severin said slowly, and Ophelia saw understanding dawn in her ancient eyes. 4 months of negotiation produced language that satisfied no one. Both houses compromised to the point of resentment. Exactly, Soren said. So here is my proposal. We begin again. Fresh negotiation, fresh language, fresh vellum. And while we negotiate, Miss Hartley will prepare the inks and materials needed for whatever document we eventually produce. He looked directly at Lord Corvus. 40 nights. That should be sufficient for both the diplomatic and calligraphic work, yes? 40 nights? Lord Corvus's face was darkening. You're stalling. I'm being practical. Unless you'd prefer to sign a decree that no one has actually seen, written in whatever language my calligrapher produces without oversight? Soren's eyebrows rose. I admit that would be faster. Shall we try it? Miss Hartley, do you think you could draft terms for a political marriage entirely on your own? No, Your Majesty. I'm not qualified. Pity. Then it seems we'll need to do this properly. He turned back to Lord Corvus. 40 nights, beginning tomorrow. We'll reconvene the negotiating committee, and Miss Hartley will attend to take notes and begin preparation of materials. Does House Corvus accept these terms? It wasn't really a question. The way Soren phrased it, the way he stood, the sheer weight of his presence, it was already decided. Lord Corvus could accept, or he could break with House Hael entirely and start a conflict that would tear Vienna's vampire society apart. We accept, Lady Isolde said, before her father could speak. She met Soren's eyes with something that looked almost like amusement. 40 nights. May they prove illuminating. The court began to disperse. Ophelia stood by the ruined table, trying to process what had just happened. She'd destroyed the marriage decree. Instead of being punished, she'd been assigned to recreate it. And King Soren Hael had just bought himself 40 days of freedom from a marriage he'd been about to sign. Why? Miss Hartley. His voice was close, and she startled. He'd moved without her noticing, now standing beside her at the table. Up close, she could see details she'd never been near enough to observe before. The way his coat was embroidered with silver thread in patterns that might have been genealogical records, the single ring he wore on his right hand, the faint scent of old books and older stone that seemed to cling to him. Your Majesty, she managed, dropping into a curtsy that nearly sent her sprawling because her knees were still weak. His hand caught her elbow, steadying her. His touch was cool through the fabric of her sleeve. You're terrified, he observed. Understandable but unnecessary. You're not being punished. I destroyed a treaty, Your Majesty. You destroyed a document. The treaty, such as it was, destroyed itself months ago through sheer unwieldiness. He released her elbow but didn't step back. Tell me, what did you think of it? The decree. You spent 6 weeks transcribing every word. You must have formed some opinion. The question was so unexpected that she answered honestly. It was terrible, Your Majesty. His expression didn't change, but something lit in his eyes. Terrible? The language was contradictory in places. The territorial clauses would have required enforcement mechanisms that weren't specified. And the personal terms, she caught herself. I apologize. I shouldn't. The personal terms? He prompted. She shouldn't say it. She absolutely shouldn't say it. They read more like a property transfer than a marriage contract. Silence. Then Soren laughed, the sound sudden and genuine. Several vampires still lingering in the hall turned to stare. A property transfer, he repeated. Yes, that's exactly what it was. He was grinning now, and it transformed his face from austere to something almost boyish. 6 weeks you spent copying that monstrosity, and you hated every word, didn't you? It wasn't my place to. Miss Hartley, Ophelia. The use of her first name shocked her into silence. I'm going to tell you something that will sound absurd, but I assure you it's the truth. That spill was the first genuinely interesting thing to happen in this court in approximately 2 decades. She stared at him. 40 nights, he said. You'll need workspace, materials, access to the archives for precedent documents. I'll have Mrs. Ashford arrange it, and you'll attend all the negotiation sessions. Someone should be there who actually understands how contracts work. Your Majesty, I'm just a calligrapher. You're the person who just pointed out that our carefully negotiated treaty was legally incoherent. That makes you currently the most useful person in this entire building. He glanced at the ruined decree, still dripping ink onto the priceless rug. Leave this. The servants will clean it. Go back to your rooms, rest, and tomorrow we'll begin again. He turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Miss Hartley? The betting book in the servants' quarters. I believe Mrs. Ashford placed 11-to-1 odds that I'd sign before dawn. Ophelia's face went hot. You know about the betting book? I'm 300 years old. I know about everything that happens in my household." His smile was wicked. "I had 20 pounds on myself refusing to sign. The ink spill is inconvenient for several reasons, but the primary one is that I won't collect my winnings." He walked away, leaving Ophelia alone with the ruined decree and the creeping suspicion that she'd just become a piece in a game she didn't fully understand. The ink room was Ophelia's sanctuary, and she fled to it as soon as she was dismissed. 3 floors below the main court, carved into the limestone foundations of what had once been a monastery, it was all stone walls and careful temperature control. Rows of pigments in glass jars lined the shelves: vermilion and verdigris, ultramarine and yellow ochre, lead white and lamp black. The oak gall ink she'd spilled had been brewing for 3 months, the recipe precise and unforgiving. The house cat, a massive orange creature named Tiberius, who belonged to no one and everyone, was sitting on her stool. "Off," Ophelia said, and Tiberius gave her a look of profound judgment before relocating to the windowsill. She sank onto the stool and put her head in her hands. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving her shaky and confused. She should be dead, or at least dismissed, sent back to whatever mortal life she could scrape together after being fired from the most prestigious calligraphy position in Vienna. Instead, she had 40 nights to recreate the decree she'd destroyed, and the king of the Vienna coven had called her by her first name and told her the spill was interesting. "I'm going mad," she told Tiberius. "That's the only explanation." Tiberius purred, which was deeply unhelpful. The betting book was still on her work table, left by one of the other servants. She picked it up, flipping through pages of cramped handwriting. Bets on everything. Which elder would fall asleep during court sessions? How many petitioners would be heard each week? Whether Lord Corvus would lose his temper during negotiations? And there, 3 pages in, will H.M. sign the decree before dawn? 11 to 1 odds. 23 pounds wagered on yes. And in different handwriting, careful and elegant, 20 pounds on no. S.H. Soren Hael. The king had bet against his own wedding. Ophelia closed the book and looked around her ink room. 6 weeks she'd spent preparing that decree. 6 weeks of grinding pigments, testing recipes, practicing the elaborate court hand required for legal documents. She'd reinforced the vellum with gum arabic, ruled the lines with a silver point stylus, mixed the ink with iron salts and oak galls collected from specific trees in specific seasons. Every step had been precise, controlled, perfect, and then she'd knocked it over with her elbow because she'd been trying to reach for a blotter and misses. Ashford had called her name at exactly the wrong moment. Except King Soren hadn't seemed angry. He'd seemed delighted. "What am I missing?" she asked Tiberius. The cat blinked slowly and went to sleep. Ophelia pulled out a clean sheet of paper and began making notes. If she had 40 nights to recreate the decree, she'd need to start immediately. New vellum she could send to the suppliers in the morning. Oak galls there might be enough left from the previous harvest, but she'd need to check. The ink itself took time to brew properly, the tannins extracting slowly in a mixture of water and wine. She was deep in calculations when Mrs. Ashford appeared in the doorway, looking harried. "Miss Hartley, still awake, I see." "I'm trying to figure out the timeline for materials," Ophelia said. "If I need to recreate the decree, you'll have help this time. His Majesty has instructed me to assign you 2 assistants and provide whatever funding you require." Mrs. Ashford set a leather purse on the table. It clinked heavily. "That's for immediate expenses. More if you need it." Ophelia stared at the purse. "Mrs. Ashford, what's happening? Really happening?" The older woman looked at her for a long moment. She'd been managing the household for longer than Ophelia had been alive, and there was very little that escaped her notice. "Between us, girl? Please." His Majesty has been looking for a way out of that marriage for 3 months. The negotiation was pushed by the elders, by House Corvus, by half the court. It's good strategy, good politics, good sense. She paused. His Majesty doesn't give a damn about good sense. But he was going to sign it. Tonight. He would have, because the pressure was becoming unbearable, and because disappointing the entire court has consequences even for a king. Mrs. Ashford smiled slightly. "And then you knocked over the ink pot." "I didn't do it on purpose," Ophelia said weakly. I know that. His Majesty knows that. But it gave him exactly what he needed, a legitimate reason to delay without insulting House Corvus. She picked up the betting book, glanced at the final entry, and her smile widened. Clever man. He'll use these 40 nights to find another solution. What solution? The problems that marriage was supposed to solve don't go away just because the decree is ruined. That, Miss Hartley, is above both our stations, but I suspect we'll find out. Mrs. Ashford headed for the door, then paused. One more thing. You'll be working closely with His Majesty during the negotiations. You'll attend sessions, take notes, likely spend considerable time in his presence. Yes? He's not like the others. The old ones, they see mortals as temporary. Useful, perhaps, entertaining sometimes, but ultimately ephemeral. His Majesty is different. He pays attention, he remembers, he cares, in ways that can be dangerous for everyone involved. Mrs. Ashford's expression was serious. Guard your heart, girl. Working for vampires is one thing. Mattering to them is something else entirely. She left, and Ophelia was alone with the cat and the purse of money and the growing certainty that she'd stumbled into something far more complicated than a spilled ink pot. The negotiations began the next evening in the East Chamber, a room lined with tapestries older than most nations. Ophelia arrived early with her supplies, fresh paper, multiple quills, ink in 3 colors for different types of annotations. She'd barely slept, spending the day organizing her thoughts and trying to understand what was expected of her. The negotiating committee assembled gradually. Lady Severin for House Hael, ancient and sharp as broken glass. Lord Corvus and his daughter Isolde for House Corvus, the father still radiating fury. 3 neutral arbiters from other covens, brought in to ensure fairness. Various advisors and observers, creating a crowd of pale faces and elaborate clothing that filled the chamber with the susurrus of silk and old power. Soren arrived last, and the room fell silent. He'd changed from the elaborate court clothing of the previous night to something simpler. Dark trousers, a white shirt, a coat of deep blue wool that made his gray eyes look almost silver. He moved through the crowd with easy confidence, greeting people by name, making small jokes that eased the tension in the room. He saw Ophelia and detoured to her corner. Miss Hartley, you look exhausted. Did you sleep at all? Some, Your Majesty. Liar. But he said it gently. You'll need to pace yourself. 40 nights is a long time to run on nervous energy alone. He glanced at her supplies. 3 colors of ink? Red for disputed terms, black for accepted language, blue for questions that need research. Clever. May I see your notes from last night? She hadn't expected that. She fumbled with her papers, producing the sheet where she'd written her observations about the original decree. They're not formal, Your Majesty, just my thoughts. He took the paper and read in silence. Ophelia watched anxiety creep up her spine as his expression remained neutral. Then he looked up, and he was grinning. Clause 17 creates an enforcement paradox that would require both parties to simultaneously act as judge and defendant in any territorial dispute. He read aloud. This is either brilliant or catastrophically stupid, and I suspect the latter. He laughed. You wrote this? I shouldn't have. It wasn't professional. It's the most honest assessment of that document anyone has provided. The lawyers on both sides spent 4 months producing that mess, and not one of them pointed out the obvious problems. He handed back the paper. Tonight, I want you to do more than take notes. If you see problems, logical gaps, contradictions, anything that doesn't make sense, you speak up. Your Majesty, I'm not qualified to. You're qualified to think clearly, which is more than I can say for half this room. He glanced at the assembled vampires, his expression unreadable. We're about to spend hours arguing about territory and bloodlines and ancient insults. Someone should be here who actually cares whether the words we use mean anything. Lord Corvus won't like it. Lord Corvus doesn't like anything. That's not a reason to avoid doing it. Soren moved closer, lowering his voice. 40 nights, Miss Hartley. I bought us 40 nights to find a better solution than that catastrophe of a decree. But I can't do it alone. I need someone in these sessions who isn't invested in vampire politics, who can see the problems without being blinded by 4 centuries of grudges. Why me? The question burst out before she could stop it. You have advisors, lawyers, people who actually know how vampire law works, all of whom have their own agendas and allegiances. You spilled ink on a marriage contract because you reached for a blotter at the wrong moment. There's no strategy in that, no hidden motive. You're here by accident, which makes you the only person in this building I can trust to have no ulterior purpose. Before she could respond, Lord Corvus called the session to order. Soren moved to his seat at the head of the table, and Ophelia scrambled to prepare her materials. The only person he could trust. The words echoed in her head, strange and weighty and oddly thrilling. The negotiation began. It was brutal. Not violent, but vicious in the way only centuries-old vampires arguing about power could be vicious. Every word was a battle. Every clause was a war. The territorial boundary established in 1734 must stand, Lord Corvus insisted. It was witnessed by the Emperor himself. The Emperor in question was mentally incompetent and died 3 months later, Lady Severin countered. The boundary was a compromise that satisfied no one and has been disputed ever since. Then what do you propose? That we simply ignore 3 centuries of precedent? I propose we acknowledge that the boundary was poorly drawn and redraw it based on actual current usage rather than the whims of a mad emperor. Ophelia wrote frantically, trying to keep up. Red ink for the boundary dispute, black ink for the procedural language everyone agreed on, blue ink for the question of how to handle historical precedent. The page filled rapidly. An hour in, they hit the first major impasse. The marriage itself. What powers would Lady Isolde have as queen consort? What territories would come under her direct control? What happened if the marriage produced no heirs? The traditional consort rights, Lord Corvus said firmly, as specified in the 1603 agreement between House Dracul and House Voss. Lady Severin shook her head. That agreement was negotiated before the Congress of Vienna and assumes political structures that no longer exist. We need modern terms. The old forms exist for a reason. The old forms exist because no one has bothered to update them in 200 years. Enough. Soren's voice cut through the argument. We're arguing about consort rights for a marriage that doesn't exist yet. Perhaps we should establish the basic terms of the union before we worry about the distribution of power within it. The basic terms are obvious, Lord Corvus said. The marriage binds House Hael to House Corvus. It resolves our territorial disputes through alliance rather than conflict. It strengthens both houses against external threats. Does it? Soren leaned back in his chair. Or does it create a combined household so powerful that every other coven in Europe feels threatened? Because I've had 3 very concerned letters from the Paris court asking whether this marriage represents a prelude to territorial expansion. Let them be concerned. We're not responsible for their paranoia. We are if their paranoia leads to a coalition against us. The argument spiraled from there. Ophelia wrote until her hand cramped, marking contradictions and questions in blue ink. The decree was supposed to solve problems, but every clause seemed to create 3 more issues. It was like watching people build a house without bothering to check if the foundation was level. 2 hours in, she couldn't take it anymore. "Excuse me," she said, her voice too quiet. No one heard her. "Excuse me," she tried again, louder. The room fell silent. 20 vampires turned to look at her, and Ophelia felt her courage falter. But Soren was watching her with an expression of interest, and she'd promised to speak up. "You're arguing about consort rights," she said, "but no one has actually defined what the marriage is for. Is it a political alliance, a territorial merger, a personal union? Because those are 3 different things, and they require 3 different sets of terms." Lord Corvus's expression was venomous. "We all know what the marriage is for." "Do we?" Ophelia looked at her notes, covered in red and blue ink. "Because half the clauses treat it as a political treaty between sovereign houses. The other half treat it as a traditional vampire marriage with one dominant house absorbing the other. Those are contradictory structures." "The girl has a point," one of the neutral arbiters said slowly. The 1603 precedent Lord Corvus cited assumes hierarchical absorption, but the territorial clauses preserve House Corvus as a separate entity. Both can be true, Lord Corvus snapped. Can they? Soren was smiling slightly. Miss Hartley, what problems do you see with attempting both structures simultaneously? She shouldn't be doing this. This was vampire politics, centuries old, and she was a mortal calligrapher with no business having opinions. But he'd asked, and everyone was waiting. If House Corvus remains independent, then the marriage is essentially a very expensive alliance treaty, and you don't need the personal union at all. You could accomplish the same thing with a standard non-aggression pact. She paused. But if it's a true marriage, then House Corvus should be absorbed into House Hael according to traditional hierarchy, which means all the territorial clauses about preserved independence are meaningless. Silence. You're saying the decree is trying to accomplish two mutually exclusive goals, Lady Severin said. Yes, my lady? And the compromise language makes it legally incoherent. Yes, my lady. More silence. Then Lady Isolde Corvus laughed, the sound bright and unexpected. She's right. Father, she's absolutely right. We've spent 4 months trying to create a marriage that's simultaneously hierarchical and equal. No wonder every clause contradicts the previous one. Lord Corvus looked murderous. We negotiated in good faith. We negotiated poorly, Lady Isolde said. She looked at Soren. Your Majesty, I propose we start from a more basic question. Is this marriage what either of us actually wants? The room erupted. Ophelia shrank back in her chair, certain she'd just caused an incident, but Soren was grinning outright now, and he let the chaos run for a moment before calling for silence. Lady Isolde raises an interesting question, he said. The marriage has been discussed for so long that we've all started treating it as inevitable, but Miss Hartley's observation suggests we should examine our assumptions. He looked directly at Lord Corvus. Why does House Corvus want this marriage, specifically and honestly? For the same reasons we've stated from the beginning. Your daughter asked an honest question. I'm asking you to provide an honest answer. Soren's voice was mild, but there was steel underneath. Not the diplomatic language, the real reason. Lord Corvus's jaw worked. Finally, grudgingly, House Corvus wants security. The territorial disputes drain resources we can't spare. A marriage alliance would end the conflict without requiring us to concede ground we've held for 2 centuries. So you want peace without surrender? Yes. And what does House Hael gain from this arrangement? The question hung in the air. Lady Severin shifted uncomfortably. The other House Hael advisors found reasons to study the tapestries. That, Soren said quietly, is the problem, isn't it? This marriage solves House Corvus's problems. It doesn't solve any of ours. We'd gain an alliance with a house we've successfully stalemated for 200 years, and in exchange we'd accept the burden of all your territorial responsibilities. He leaned forward. So, yes, Lady Isolde, let's ask the basic question. Is this marriage what either of us actually wants? Lady Isolde met his eyes. Something passed between them, some understanding that Ophelia couldn't quite read. No, Lady Isolde said. It isn't. I have nothing against you personally, Your Majesty, but this marriage was my father's strategy, not mine. What do you want? Soren asked. A council seat. Direct representation in the Vienna court, not filtered through marriage alliance. House Corvus has enough wealth and age to merit it, but we've been locked out because of the territorial disputes. She glanced at her father. The marriage was supposed to be the price of admission. You want to skip the marriage and go straight to the seat? Yes. Lord Corvus surged to his feet. Isolde, you're speaking out of turn. I'm speaking the truth, which is more than these negotiations have involved for months. She turned to her father. You want to preserve House Corvus as independent and powerful. Marriage to House Hael doesn't accomplish that. It just subordinates us in prettier language. The session dissolved into chaos. Ophelia sat frozen, watching centuries of vampire politics crack open around a simple question she'd prompted by pointing out a logical contradiction. Lord Corvus was shouting, Lady Severin was arguing back, the neutral arbiters were trying to restore order. Soren stood. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make any dramatic gesture, but the room fell silent anyway. That was the power of 3 centuries of kingship, the ability to command attention without demanding it. "We'll adjourn for tonight," he said. "Clearly we have more thinking to do. Reconvene tomorrow at the same time." His eyes swept the room. "And I suggest everyone spend the intervening hours considering Lady Isolde's question. What do we actually want from these negotiations?" The vampires filed out, most of them looking shaken. Ophelia began gathering her materials with trembling hands. She'd just participated in destroying marriage negotiations that were supposed to prevent a vampire civil war. She'd questioned Lord Corvus in front of the entire committee. She'd probably just ended her career and possibly her life. "Miss Hartley." Soren's voice, quiet and amused. "A word?" She turned. He was standing by the window, and in the lamplight his white hair gleamed like silver. "Your Majesty, one apologize. I shouldn't have spoken." "You should have spoken months ago. If someone had bothered to ask a calligrapher's opinion before we spent 4 months negotiating nonsense, we could have saved a great deal of trouble." He moved closer. "You've just done something remarkable. You've given Lady Isolde the opening to say what she's been thinking for months. You've exposed the fundamental flaw in these negotiations, and you've given me exactly what I need." "What you need, Your Majesty?" "Leverage, time, options." He smiled. 40 nights, remember? We're only on night 2, and already the entire structure of the negotiation has changed. Lord Corvus wanted a marriage decree. Now he's going to have to defend why his house deserves a council seat without offering anything in return. You're going to give them the seat? Perhaps, if the price is right. But that's a negotiation about power and resources, not about my personal freedom. He picked up her notes, scanning the pages covered in 3 colors of ink. "These are good. Clear, logical, thorough. Tomorrow I want you to prepare a brief. What would a council seat arrangement look like? What precedents exist? What would House Corvus need to offer in exchange?" "Your Majesty, I'm not a lawyer." "You're someone who thinks clearly and writes well. That's more valuable than legal training." He handed back the notes. "Go rest. Tomorrow will be harder." She gathered her materials and fled, her heart hammering. Behind her, she heard Soren laugh quietly, as if the entire evening had been exactly what he'd hoped for. The 40 nights became a rhythm. Negotiations each evening, research and writing during the day, stolen hours in the ink room grinding pigments and brewing the oak gall ink that would eventually be needed for whatever document they produced. Ophelia found herself pulled deeper into vampire politics than any mortal should be, taking notes and asking questions and slowly, gradually, understanding the centuries-old grudges that shaped every clause. And Soren was always there, watching her with those winter-gray eyes, asking her opinion, trusting her judgment in ways that should have been frightening, but somehow weren't. "You're spending a lot of time with His Majesty," Mrs. Ashford observed one afternoon, as Ophelia rushed through the kitchens grabbing food between sessions. "People are starting to notice." "I'm doing my job," Ophelia said defensively. "Are you?" Mrs. Ashford's expression was unreadable. "Because your job is calligraphy, dear girl, not diplomatic strategy. He asks my opinion. He does more than that. He listens to you, trusts you. That's dangerous." "Why does everyone keep saying that?" Ophelia set down the bread she'd been about to eat. "I'm helping negotiate a better treaty. Why is that dangerous?" Mrs. Ashford sighed. "Because vampires don't trust mortals. Not really. We're temporary to them, here and gone in what feels to them like a heartbeat. His Majesty treating you as an equal, valuing your judgment, that means something. And it means something different to him than it does to you." "What does that mean?" "It means you'll be gone in a human lifetime, and he'll be here for centuries more. Whatever connection you're building, it ends badly for at least one of you." The words stung, but Ophelia pushed them aside. She had work to do. By night 15, the negotiations had transformed. The marriage decree was functionally dead, though no one had officially said so. Instead, they were hammering out terms for House Corvus to receive a council seat in exchange for territorial concessions and a formal end to the disputes. Lord Corvus fought every point, but Lady Isolde was increasingly taking the lead for her house, and she was proving to be a shrewd negotiator. Your house would retain control of the Eastern holdings, Soren said, reviewing the latest draft Ophelia had prepared, but the North Territory would become neutral ground administered by the full council. That territory has been ours for a century, Lord Corvus objected, and contested by 3 other houses for just as long. Making it neutral ground resolves all 4 disputes simultaneously. Soren glanced at Ophelia. Miss Hartley, what's the precedent for neutral territory administration? She'd researched this exact question the day before, knowing it would come up. The Prague Accords of 1756 established neutral ground in Bohemia, Your Majesty. The territory was administered by a rotating committee from the 5 largest houses, with resources shared according to a formula based on population and need. And did it work? For 70 years, yes. It broke down during the Napoleonic Wars when the normal governance structures collapsed, but the model itself was successful. Soren looked back at Lord Corvus. Precedent suggests it's viable. Precedent from 70 years before our time, Lord Corvus muttered, but he didn't push back harder. That was the pattern now. He'd object. Ophelia would provide research, and slowly the new treaty took shape. Lady Isolde caught Ophelia after the session ended. Miss Hartley, a moment? Ophelia's stomach clenched. Lady Isolde had been cordial but distant through the negotiations, focused on the political aspects. A private conversation felt ominous. My lady, walk with me. It wasn't a request. They walked through the corridors of the house, past centuries of accumulated art and history. Lady Isolde moved with the fluid grace of all old vampires, and next to her, Ophelia felt clumsy and obvious. You've been very helpful in these negotiations, Lady Isolde said, more helpful than anyone expected. Thank you, my lady. That wasn't a compliment. Not entirely. She stopped by a window overlooking the inner courtyard. You realize you've derailed a marriage that was supposed to prevent a war? The marriage wouldn't have prevented anything, Ophelia said carefully. The decree was contradictory and unenforceable. True, but it was also a symbol, a visible commitment to peace between our houses. Without it, she trailed off. Without it, you're negotiating a better treaty, one based on actual interests rather than symbolic gestures. Lady Isolde smiled. You sound like Soren. The use of his first name was jarring. I'm just trying to be logical, my lady. Logic and vampire politics rarely mix. She turned to face Ophelia directly. I'm going to tell you something, Miss Hartley, and I'd appreciate if you'd keep it between us. I didn't want that marriage. Not because I dislike Soren, he's intelligent and honorable and would probably be a decent husband as vampire marriages go. But I've spent 2 centuries building my own power, my own reputation, and the marriage would have subordinated all of that to my father's ambitions. Then why agree to it? Because sometimes duty outweighs preference. Because my house needed it. Because... She paused. Because I thought it was inevitable. And then you spilled ink on the decree, and Soren grabbed the opportunity to delay, and suddenly the inevitable became negotiable. I didn't do it on purpose, my lady. I know, that's what makes it perfect. Lady Isolde's expression was unreadable. But here's what you need to understand. Soren is grateful to you. He might even be fascinated by you. But vampires don't build futures with mortals, Miss Hartley. We can't. You're too fragile, too temporary. Whatever is growing between you, it ends the same way, with you in the ground and him moving on. The words were almost identical to Mrs. Ashford's warning, but hearing them from Lady Isolde made them feel more real. There's nothing growing between us, Ophelia said, but her voice lacked conviction. I'm just his employee. You're the person whose opinion he trusts over his own advisors. You're the first person he looks for when he enters a room. You're the reason he's fighting this hard to avoid a marriage he never wanted. Lady Isolde touched Ophelia's shoulder gently. I'm not telling you this to be cruel. I'm telling you this because I recognize what's happening, and I'd spare you the pain if I could. Guard your heart, Miss Hartley, for your own sake. She walked away, leaving Ophelia alone in the corridor with her notes and her confusion and the growing certainty that Lady Isolde was right about more than she wanted to admit. That night, unable to sleep, Ophelia returned to the ink room. The oak gall ink was ready, the tannins fully extracted, the color a deep black that would last centuries. She'd started preparing fresh vellum, though the treaty they were negotiating now would be different from the original decree. Simpler, probably. More focused on practicalities than pageantry. "You're here late." She spun. Soren stood in the doorway, still in his evening clothes, looking amused. "Your Majesty, I didn't hear you." "Vampire." We move quietly. He entered the room, looking around at the organized chaos of her workspace. "You've been avoiding me since the session ended. Did Lady Isolde say something?" "No, yes, it's not important." "Ophelia." He moved closer. "What did she say?" The use of her first name still shocked her every time. "She said vampires don't build futures with mortals, that whatever is happening between us, it's temporary because I'm temporary." "Ah." He was silent for a moment, studying the jars of pigment on her shelves. She's not wrong. The admission hurt more than it should have. "I know." "Do you?" "Because I'm 300 years old, Ophelia. I've employed dozens of mortals over the centuries. Most of them blur together in memory, but every once in a while." He picked up a jar of vermilion, holding it to the lamplight. "Every once in a while, you meet someone who reminds you what it's like to be surprised. Someone who looks at a marriage decree the entire court treats as inevitable and sees only bad legal language. Someone who asks the obvious questions everyone else is too invested to ask. 'Your Majesty, Soren, when we're alone, please. I'm tired of formality.' That's not appropriate. Neither is trusting a mortal calligrapher with my kingdom's political future, but here we are." He set down the jar and turned to face her. "Lady Isolde is right that you're temporary in ways I'm not. But that doesn't mean these 40 nights don't matter. It doesn't mean what you've done isn't remarkable, and it doesn't mean I'm not grateful for every frustrating, fascinating moment you've given me." Her heart was doing complicated things in her chest. "I spilled ink on your marriage decree. Best thing that's happened to me in decades." He was close now, close enough that she could see the silver threads in his gray eyes, the way his white hair fell across his forehead. "Ophelia, I need to know something. These negotiations, this treaty we're building, are you doing this because it's your job or because you believe it's the right thing to do?" "Both," she said honestly. "The original decree was terrible. This treaty is better, more honest, more practical, more likely to actually accomplish what everyone claims they want. And if it works, if House Corvus accepts a council seat and we end 2 centuries of territorial disputes, what happens to you? I write the final treaty, I bind it properly, and then I go back to being a calligrapher. Is that what you want?" The question was too large, too complicated. "I don't know what I want, Your Majesty Soren. A month ago I was grinding pigments and copying tax records. Now I'm in the middle of vampire politics, negotiating treaties I don't fully understand, spending time with—" She caught herself. "With me," he finished quietly. "Spending time with me." "Yes." He reached out slowly, giving her time to move away, and touched her face. His hand was cool, but not cold, not lifeless, just the temperature of someone whose heart beat differently than hers. "I'm going to be honest with you because you deserve honesty. I don't know what this is between us. I don't know if it's gratitude or fascination or something more complicated, but I know I look forward to seeing you every evening. I know your observations are the most valuable input I receive in those sessions. I know I'm delaying this treaty more than I should because once it's finished, our excuse to work together ends. You're delaying a treaty that could prevent a war because you want to spend time with me?" Ophelia's voice rose. "That's insane. That's probably unwise," he agreed. "But I'm not delaying that much. And the treaty is better for the extra time. We're building something solid, not rushing to meet an artificial deadline." His thumb brushed her cheekbone. "I have decades, Ophelia. Centuries. I can afford to take 40 nights to do something properly. And then what? Lady Isolde is right. I'm mortal. In 40 years I'll be old. In 80 I'll be dead. You'll still be here, exactly as you are now." "Yes. So this, whatever this is, it's just 40 nights." And then we go back to being king and employee, and eventually I'll just be another blurred memory of a mortal who worked for you once. No. His voice was fierce suddenly. You won't blur, Ophelia. You're too vivid for that. Too sharp, too honest, too frustratingly good at seeing through centuries of accumulated nonsense. He dropped his hand. But you're right that 40 nights is all we have. So the question is, what do we do with them? She should walk away. She should remember Mrs. Ashford's warning, Lady Isolde's advice, the basic absurdity of a mortal calligrapher falling for a vampire king. But he was looking at her like she mattered, like her opinion counted, like she was more than just temporary. We finish the treaty, she said. Properly, no more delays. We build something that lasts beyond 40 nights, even if we don't. His expression softened. The pragmatic choice. The right choice. Yes. He stepped back, and the moment broke. Then let's do it right. Tomorrow we'll push for final terms. No more dancing around the hard questions. He left, and Ophelia sank onto her stool, her hands shaking. Tiberius jumped into her lap, purring, and she buried her face in his fur and tried not to think about how 40 nights was going to feel like both forever and nowhere near enough time. The next 2 weeks were brutal. Lord Corvus fought every concession, even as Lady Isolde increasingly took control of the House Corvus negotiating position. The territorial questions were resolved through a combination of precedent research Ophelia provided and compromises that left no one entirely happy, but everyone willing to live with the results. By night 30, they had a workable treaty. House Corvus would receive a council seat in exchange for territorial concessions and a formal end to hostilities. The marriage decree was officially dead, replaced by a mutual defense pact that respected both houses' independence. It was practical, enforceable, and addressed the actual problems that had caused 2 centuries of conflict. Ophelia began preparing the final vellum. This decree would be simpler than the original marriage document, but it still needed to be perfect. She selected the finest calfskin, prepared it with gum arabic for extra strength, mixed special ink that would bond permanently to the vellum. Every step was careful, controlled, precise. Soren visited her ink room often during those final days, sometimes with questions about the document, sometimes just to talk, always staying longer than necessary. They never repeated that almost moment from night 20, but it hung between them possibility and impossibility tangled together. Do you ever regret it? She asked him on night 35. The treaty was nearly complete. The text finalized, only the ceremonial signing remaining. Being immortal, watching everyone around you age and die. He was quiet for a long time. Sometimes. Mostly, I regret not remembering them better. The mortals I've known over the centuries, most of them fade. I can't tell you the name of my calligrapher from 100 years ago. Can't recall what my household manager looked like in 1850. They all blur together into a sense of vague fondness and loss. That's sad. It's survival. If I remembered everyone clearly, carried all that loss, I'd go mad. He looked at her. But there are exceptions. People who burn bright enough that they never fade. I suspect you're going to be one of those exceptions, Ophelia, whether I want you to be or not. Is that why you're avoiding me between sessions? Because I'm going to be a painful memory? I'm avoiding you because I'm 300 years old and I should have better sense than to fall for a mortal calligrapher who spilled ink on my marriage decree. He said it lightly, but there was real emotion underneath. You're falling for me? I've already fallen. I'm just trying to decide what to do about it. The confession stole her breath. Soren, don't. Don't say anything kind or understanding or forgiving. I'm old enough to know better. I should have kept this professional, kept you at a distance, respected the boundaries that exist for good reasons. He moved to the window. But I didn't. And now we have 5 nights left, and then the treaty is signed, and then you go back to your ink room, and I go back to running a kingdom, and we pretend this never happened. What if I don't want to pretend? He turned. Ophelia, what if I'm falling too? What if I know it's stupid and temporary and doomed, but I'm doing it anyway? She set down her quill. You said you don't know what to do about it. Neither do I. But I know I don't want to spend these last 5 nights avoiding each other because we're afraid of what comes after. I'm 300 years old. You're what, 25? 26. I'll still be here in a century. You won't. That's not something we can negotiate around. I know. She stood and walked to him. He didn't move, watching her approach with an expression of careful control. But we have 5 nights. Can't we take them? For a long moment he didn't answer. Then he reached out and pulled her close, and when he kissed her, it was with the hunger of someone who'd been holding back for too long. His mouth was cool but urgent, and Ophelia kissed him back with all the confusion and desire and impossible hope that had been building for 35 nights. When they broke apart, his control was fractured. This is a terrible idea. Probably. It ends badly for both of us. Definitely. 5 nights, he said. That's all we have. Then we'd better make them count. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. On night 37, Lord Corvus played his final card. The negotiating session began normally. They were reviewing the final text of the treaty, making small adjustments to language. Ophelia had the vellum ready, the ink prepared, the materials laid out for the ceremonial transcription. 3 more nights, and everything would be finalized. Lord Corvus arrived late, and he brought a leather document case. "Before we proceed," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage, "I believe the court should see something." He opened the case and pulled out a sheaf of papers. Ophelia recognized them immediately, her notes from the negotiating sessions. The original observations she'd made about the marriage decree. Personal comments she'd written for her own reference, never intending them to be seen by the negotiating committee. "These are notes made by Miss Hartley," Lord Corvus said, "the mortal calligrapher who has, inexplicably, been granted a voice in these negotiations." He read from the top page. "The marriage decree appears designed to trap House Corvus in subordinate alliance while maintaining the fiction of equal partnership. House Hael gains everything. House Corvus sacrifices independence for dubious promises of protection." The room went cold. "Those were private notes," Ophelia said, her voice shaking. "Made before I understood the full context, before you became His Majesty's pet mortal." Lord Corvus's smile was vicious. "This treaty we've been negotiating, it's a sham. A manipulation orchestrated by King Soren and his tame human advisor to destroy the marriage alliance and leave House Corvus with nothing." "That's not true," Soren said, his voice dangerous. "Isn't it? You've spent 40 nights dismantling a marriage that was supposed to unite our houses. You've used this girl to undermine every clause that protected House Corvus's interests. And now, you expect us to accept a treaty that gives us a council seat we should have had already, in exchange for territory we've held for centuries?" Lord Corvus threw the papers on the table. "House Corvus withdraws from these negotiations. The treaty is void. The marriage decree stands." "The marriage decree was destroyed," Lady Severn said quietly. "Then it will be recreated, exactly as it was, with all the terms House Hael found so objectionable." Lord Corvus looked at his daughter. "Isolde, we're leaving." Lady Isolde hadn't moved. She was staring at Ophelia's notes spread across the table. "Father, where did you get these?" "That's irrelevant. Where did you get them?" Her voice was sharp. He hesitated. "From sources within House Hael. It seems not everyone approves of His Majesty's pet mortal." Ophelia's mind raced. The notes had been in her room, locked in her desk. Someone had broken in, stolen them, given them to Lord Corvus. Someone who wanted the negotiations to fail. Soren stood slowly. The movement was utterly controlled, but Ophelia could see fury in every line of his body. "Who?" "I don't reveal my sources." "Who?" The word was a command that brooked no refusal. From the cluster of House Hael advisors, an older vampire stepped forward. Lord Constantine, one of the elders who'd served under Soren's predecessor. "I provided the documents. Someone needed to show you the truth, Your Majesty. This mortal has been manipulating you from the beginning. She destroyed the marriage decree deliberately, then positioned herself as invaluable to give you reason to delay. She's human. They're cunning in ways we forget at our peril." "That's insane," Ophelia said. "I knocked over an inkpot." "Did you?" Or did you see an opportunity and take it? Lord Constantine's expression was pitying. Your Majesty, you've been compromised. This girl has twisted your judgment, used your attraction to her to undermine alliances that could have strengthened our house. The evidence is in her own handwriting. Soren looked at Ophelia. For one terrible moment she saw doubt in his eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by something harder. Lord Constantine, he said quietly, you're dismissed. From this negotiation, from your advisory position, from your residence in this house, you have until dawn to remove yourself and your dependents. Your Majesty, you broke into my calligrapher's quarters, stole private documents, provided them to a hostile house to sabotage negotiations I was conducting. That's not counsel. That's treason. Soren's voice was ice. Be grateful I'm only exiling you. If this were a century ago, I'd take your head. Lord Constantine paled an impressive feat for a vampire and fled. Several other advisors went with him, a clear sign that the split within House Hael was deeper than Ophelia had realized. Lord Corvus was smiling. So, you admit the documents are genuine? The documents are notes from the early stages of negotiation, before Miss Hartley had full context. They're also irrelevant. Soren turned to face the table. We've spent 40 nights building a treaty that addresses the real problems between our houses. That work stands on its own merits. If you want to reject it because you're offended by a calligrapher's private observations, that's your choice. But don't pretend it's a rational one. My choice, Lord Corvus said, is to withdraw from negotiations built on manipulation and lies. House Corvus will accept nothing less than the original marriage decree. Sign it, Your Majesty, or accept the consequences. He left. Most of his delegation followed, though Lady Isolde remained, looking torn. Father is serious, she said quietly. He'll push for war if you don't sign. Let him push, Soren said. Soren, Lady Severin began. I will not be extorted into a marriage because someone stole documents and misrepresented their context. Soren looked around the room. This negotiation is suspended, everyone out. I need to think. The room cleared. Ophelia remained, frozen by the table. Her notes were still scattered across its surface. Her words twisted into evidence of manipulation she'd never intended. You should go, Soren said, not looking at her. Are you dismissing me? I'm protecting you. Lord Corvus just declared war, effectively. You're mortal, you're vulnerable, and you're the person he'll target first if he wants to hurt me. Now he did look at her, and his expression was bleak. This is what I meant. You're temporary in ways that make you a liability as much as a treasure. I didn't manipulate you. I know. Those notes were from the first week before I understood what was really happening. I know, Ophelia. He moved to her, cupping her face in both hands. But it doesn't matter. The negotiations are destroyed. Lord Corvus will use this to rally support for the marriage decree, and I'll be forced to either sign or start a war that could tear Vienna's vampire society apart. So sign it. The words hurt coming out. Marry Lady Isolde, prevent the war. It's the logical choice. Is it? Because I'm not sure I can anymore. He kissed her forehead. Go back to your rooms, lock your door. Don't come out until I send for you. Soren, please. His voice cracked slightly. I need to fix this, and I can't do it if I'm worried about you. She left, her chest tight with fear and frustration. Behind her, Soren stood alone in the empty negotiating chamber, surrounded by the ruins of 40 nights of careful work. The next 24 hours were chaos. House Corvus formally withdrew from negotiations and began mobilizing their forces. Rumors spread through Vienna's vampire society. King Soren had been compromised by a mortal. The marriage alliance was destroyed. War was coming. Ophelia stayed in her rooms as instructed, watching through her window as messengers ran back and forth, as ancient vampires arrived for emergency councils. Mrs. Ashford brought her food and news. It's bad, dear girl. Lord Corvus has the support of at least 3 other major houses. They're saying His Majesty's judgment is compromised, that he's putting personal preference above the good of the coven. Is he? Of course he is, but that doesn't make them wrong about the consequences. Mrs. Ashford set down the tray. There's talk of a challenge. If enough elders support it, they can force a vote of no confidence. Soren could lose his throne. Ophelia's blood went cold. Over a marriage? Over questions of fitness to rule. The marriage is just the excuse. Mrs. Ashford touched her shoulder. None of this is your fault, but you're at the center of it anyway. Be careful, child. Powerful people are looking for someone to blame. She left, and Ophelia stared at the food without appetite. 40 nights ago, she'd spilled ink on a marriage decree and thought that was the worst thing that could happen. Now she was somehow the catalyst for a potential civil war among vampires, and the man she'd been falling for might lose everything because he'd trusted her. The knock on her door came at midnight. Miss Hartley, Lady Isolde's voice. May I enter? Ophelia opened the door cautiously. Lady Isolde swept in, still in her formal evening gown, looking worried. We need to talk, Lady Isolde said, and we don't have much time. What's happening? My father is pushing for a formal challenge tomorrow night. He has enough support to force a vote. If Soren loses, he'll be exiled from Vienna, and the elders will install someone more compliant. She paced the small room. It's a disaster. For both houses, for the entire coven. But my father is convinced Soren has been compromised by you, and he won't back down. What can I do? That's what I came to ask. Lady Isolde turned to face her. Soren won't sign the marriage decree. He's refused categorically, but there might be another option. What option? You need to understand something first. The objection isn't really about you manipulating Soren. It's about you being mortal. Mortals can't participate in vampire governance. It's literally against our laws. By giving you a voice in the negotiations, Soren broke centuries of tradition. That's what the elders are actually angry about. So I need to leave. Remove myself from the situation. Leaving won't help. The damage is done. The elders would still see it as evidence of Soren's poor judgment. Lady Isolde hesitated. But if you weren't mortal, the implication hit like cold water. You're suggesting I be turned? It's the only solution I can see. If you were vampire, your participation in the negotiations becomes legitimate. The elders lose their primary objection. Soren's judgment is vindicated. She met Ophelia's eyes. I'm not saying this lightly. Turning is permanent. You'd be giving up your mortal life, your human future, but it would solve the political problem. I'd become vampire to make the politics work? Ophelia's laugh was slightly hysterical. That's insane. It's vampire politics. Insanity is our baseline. Lady Isolde sat on the edge of the bed. Listen, Soren cares about you. More than he should, more than is wise, but genuinely. If you were vampire, you could actually be together. Not for 40 nights, but for centuries. The age difference stops mattering. The temporary nature of the relationship ends. It becomes possible. And if I don't want to be vampire, then you should leave Vienna tonight, before the challenge, before things get worse. Because staying mortal and staying here puts both you and Soren at risk. Ophelia sank into her chair. Turn vampire or leave. Those were her choices. Does Soren know you're here? No. He'd probably be furious. He's very protective of mortal autonomy, thinks turning should be entirely voluntary, never strategic. Lady Isolde stood. But I'm not offering this as a strategy. I'm offering it as a genuine choice. You could have centuries with him, Ophelia. You could be part of this world instead of always on the outside. You could finish the treaty negotiations from a position of legitimate authority instead of being the pet mortal everyone resents. Or I could become a vampire, and he could decide he's not actually interested in me for centuries, just for 40 nights. That's a risk, Lady Isolde admitted. But I've watched him with you. I don't think that's what's happening here. I think he's terrified of what he's feeling precisely because it's real. After Lady Isolde left, Ophelia sat in her dark room and tried to think. Becoming vampire was permanent, irreversible. She'd lose the sun. Lose the human life she'd always assumed was her future, but she'd gain time, centuries of it, with Soren if he wanted that, and she'd legitimize her participation in the negotiations, protect him from the political fallout. It was a terrible reason to be turned. It was also maybe the only solution that saved everything they'd built over 40 nights. At dawn, she went to find Soren. He was in his study, surrounded by documents, looking exhausted. He glanced up when she entered, and something complicated crossed his face. "Ophelia, you should be in your rooms. Lady Isolde came to see me." His expression hardened. "What did she say?" "That you're facing a challenge. That the elders are using me as evidence you're unfit to rule. That the only way to fix the political situation is if I'm turned." She crossed the room to stand before his desk. "Is that true?" Isolde had no right. "Is it true?" He slumped in his chair. "Possibly. Probably. If you were vampire, the primary objection disappears. But Ophelia, that's not a reason to turn. That's coercion, and I won't. What if I want to?" The question stopped him cold. "What? What if I want to be turned? Not because of the politics, or not only because of the politics. What if I want centuries instead of decades? What if I want to see how the treaty works out, and whether House Corvus actually honors their commitments, and what Vienna looks like in 100 years? She leaned on his desk. "What if I want time with you that isn't measured in 40 nights? Ophelia, I know it's permanent. I know I'd be giving up the sun, a normal human life, everything that comes with mortality. But what am I giving it up for? Decades of normal followed by death? Or centuries of extraordinary followed by, well, eventually death, but much later?" She was shaking, but the words kept coming. "You asked me what I wanted 37 nights ago, and I said I didn't know. I know now. I want more time. With you, with this work, with this impossible vampire politics, I somehow understand better than I should. I want to finish what we started." He stood and came around the desk, taking her hands. "If I turn you, I'm taking everything mortal away from you, every choice you might have had, every normal moment. You're also giving me everything immortal, every choice I couldn't have as a mortal, every extraordinary moment." She squeezed his hands. "I'm not asking you to decide for me. I'm telling you my decision. Turn me. Tonight, before the challenge, let me stand before the elders as vampire and watch them try to maintain their objection." "You're sure?" "Terrified, but sure." He pulled her close, and his embrace was tight enough to hurt. "It won't be easy. Turning is painful, the adjustment takes time, and you'll spend your first century as technically a fledgling in vampire law, lower status, fewer rights. But legitimate status, part of the society, not outside it." "Yes." "Then do it, please." He kissed her, and it felt like sealing a pact. "Tonight, after sunset. I'll need to prepare the ritual. Turning requires more than just blood exchange. There are protocols, witnesses. Who will witness? Lady Severin. She's senior enough that her presence legitimizes it. And Lady Isolde, if she's willing. This was her idea, after all." They spent the day preparing. Soren explained the ritual, the exchange of blood, the formal words, the period of death and rebirth that would take approximately 3 hours. Ophelia would die, technically, and wake as something else. "It's not like the stories," he said. "You'll still be you, your memories, personality, preferences, but you'll be stronger, faster, sharper. You'll need blood to survive, though not as much as the myths suggest. You'll be vulnerable to sunlight, to certain toxins, to beheading. You'll be functionally immortal barring violence. And I'll be vampire, part of the society, with all the rights that entails. Yes, though as a fledgling, you'll be under my protection for the first century, bound to my house, subject to my authority in vampire law. I'm already subject to your authority. You're my employer. This is different, more permanent, more binding. You'll be mine in ways that vampire law recognizes as absolute." "Yours," she repeated. "I think I'm okay with that." His smile was brilliant and brief. "Let's hope the elders are too." The ritual took place in the private chapel deep in the house's foundations. Lady Severin attended as primary witness, ancient and unreadable. Lady Isolde came as secondary witness, looking both satisfied and sad. Soren stood in his formal robes, the ceremony words prepared. "Ophelia Hartley," he said, his voice formal. "You come before this house by your own will, seeking transformation?" "I do." You understand that this change is permanent? That you will leave behind mortal life and mortal death, accepting vampire nature and vampire law? I understand. You accept binding to House Hael, subordination to its lord, protection under its name? I accept. Then, by the authority granted to me as king of the Viennese coven, I offer you the gift of blood and the curse of eternity. Do you accept both? I accept both. He bit his own wrist, and dark blood welled. Ophelia drank, the taste copper and strange and electric. Then he bit her throat, and the pain was brief before numbness spread. The ritual words washed over her in formal vampire dialect she didn't fully understand. The world started to fade, darkness creeping in from the edges. The last thing she heard was Soren whispering, "Come back to me." Then she died. Waking was violent. Ophelia surged up gasping, and her body felt wrong, too strong, too fast, too sharp. Everything was louder, brighter, more intense. She could hear heartbeats in the room above, smell old stone and older blood, taste metal in the air. Easy. Soren's hand on her shoulder steadying her. The adjustment takes time. Don't try to stand yet. But she did try to stand, and she moved too fast, stumbling into the wall hard enough to crack the stone. Soren caught her, his grip gentle despite her newfound strength. "You need to feed," he said. "Fresh blood to complete the transition. I have donors prepared. What time is it?" 2 hours before the challenge. We need to present you to the court before then. Lady Severin approached, studying Ophelia with ancient eyes. The transformation took well. She's strong, stable. This will do. "The elders won't like it," Lady Isolde said. "A fledgling granted immediate authority in negotiations. The elders don't get to approve or disapprove," Soren said flatly. "Ophelia is House Hael now, under my protection and authority. If they want to challenge her legitimacy, they'll have to challenge mine." They dressed Ophelia in formal vampire attire. Dark velvet gown, silver jewelry, the sort of clothing that marked status in vampire society. She caught her reflection in a mirror and barely recognized herself. Pale skin, yes, but not sickly luminous. Her dark hair looked richer against the pallor. Her eyes were brighter, more intense. She looked vampire, felt vampire, was vampire. It was terrifying and exhilarating and completely irreversible. The court assembled at midnight. Word had spread that King Soren would address the challenge before it was formally presented. The hall was packed with vampires, House Hael members, House Corvus delegates, neutral observers, the elders who would judge the challenge. Ophelia stood beside Soren at the dais, very aware of every eye on her. Lord Corvus stepped forward, his expression triumphant. "Your Majesty, the challenge stands. You have allowed a mortal to interfere in vampire governance, broken centuries of precedent, and prioritized personal desire over the good of the coven. I call for a vote of no confidence." "Noted," Soren said calmly. "However, the premise of your challenge is flawed. Miss Hartley was indeed mortal when she participated in our negotiations. She is no longer mortal." The court erupted. Lord Corvus's face went through several colors. "You turned her to avoid the political consequences?" "I turned her because she requested it, which is the only legitimate reason for turning." Soren's voice carried across the hall. "As of tonight, Ophelia Hartley is a member of House Hael, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails. Her participation in the treaty negotiations is now retroactively legitimate under vampire law." "She's a fledgling," one of the elders objected. "Fledglings have limited rights. Fledglings bound to a house operate under that house's authority," Lady Severin said, her ancient voice silencing the objections. "I witnessed the turning. It was properly conducted, legally binding. Ophelia Hartley is House Hael. Her actions carry the weight of that house's authority." "This is a manipulation," Lord Corvus started. "This is vampire law," Soren said flatly. "Unless you'd like to argue that turnings conducted by a sitting king are invalid? That would be an interesting precedent to establish." The elders conferred. Ophelia stood motionless, trying to look confident despite the newness of her vampire body, the strangeness of being the center of this political storm. Finally, the eldest spoke, Lady Magdalena, who remembered the fall of Rome. The turning is legitimate. House Hael's authority over its own members is absolute. The primary objection, mortal interference, is resolved. She looked at Lord Corvus. Does House Corvus wish to pursue the challenge on other grounds? Lord Corvus's jaw worked. Without the mortal interference angle, his challenge fell apart. Soren hadn't actually broken any laws, just made politically unpopular decisions. No, he finally said. But the treaty remains void. House Corvus withdraws its offer of alliance. That's your choice, Soren said. However, there is one matter to resolve. During the negotiations, certain documents were stolen from Miss Hartley's quarters and provided to House Corvus by a member of my own house. That theft and subsequent use of stolen documents to sabotage negotiations constitutes a violation of hospitality law. The temperature in the room dropped. Hospitality law was ancient, fundamental to vampire society. Violating it was a serious offense. Lord Constantine acted without our knowledge, Lord Corvus said quickly. But you used the stolen documents anyway. That makes House Corvus complicit. Soren descended from the dais. Here are my terms. House Corvus will either accept the treaty we negotiated or pay reparations for the violation of hospitality law. Your choice. The treaty was built on manipulation. The treaty was built on 40 nights of good faith negotiation, detailed research, and careful legal language. Miss Hartley's early private notes do not negate the work that followed. Soren was implacable. Treaty or reparations? Decide now. Lady Isolde stepped forward. Father, accept the treaty. It's a good deal for us, better than the marriage would have been. You're letting pride cloud your judgment. Isolde. Mother wanted us to have a council seat, she said quietly. She died wanting that for House Corvus. The treaty gives us exactly what she asked for. Don't throw it away because you're angry about how we got here. The invocation of his dead wife shook Lord Corvus visibly. He looked around the court, saw the lack of support, saw the trap closing around him. The treaty, he finally said. House Corvus accepts the treaty terms. The collective exhale in the room was audible. Soren nodded. Then we'll reconvene tomorrow night for final review and signing. Miss Hartley will prepare the ceremonial document. He glanced at Ophelia. Given that she's now vampire, I believe her calligraphy carries appropriate permanence. The court began to disperse. Ophelia stood on the dais, trying to process what had just happened. They'd won. The treaty was saved, the challenge defeated, the marriage obligation ended. And she was vampire, forever changed, bound to Soren and House Hael in ways that vampire law recognized as absolute. You're shaking, Soren said quietly, taking her arm. Everything is too loud. You need to feed properly. Come. He led her to a private room where donors waited, humans who provided blood for the household in exchange for payment and protection. The feeding was strange, intimate in ways she hadn't expected, but it steadied her. The world stopped being quite so overwhelming. How do you feel? Soren asked afterward. Vampire. Still me, but more. She looked at her pale hands. This is permanent. Are you regretting it? No, maybe. I don't know yet. She met his eyes. Ask me in 40 nights. His smile was tentative. The first 40 nights of forever. That's a very different timeline. Good different? Terrifying different. I'm 300 years old, Ophelia. I'm set in my ways, and you're a fledgling who's going to spend the next century learning what you are now. We're going to make mistakes, have problems, discover complications neither of us anticipated. Probably, she agreed, but we'll have time to work through them. Centuries. If we want them. He pulled her close. I want them. God help me, I want them more than I've wanted anything in decades. But I'm going to be terrible at this, at caring about someone who matters enough to terrify me, at adjusting to you being vampire instead of mortal, at figuring out what a relationship looks like when it's not measured in the countdown to inevitable loss. Then we'll be terrible at it together. She kissed him. Now, I have a treaty to transcribe. The final vellum is ready, the ink is prepared. I'll need 3 nights to complete it properly. 3 nights to write the document that makes you retroactively legitimate as a political advisor. He was smiling. There's a certain poetic justice to that. And then, House Corvus gets their council seat, the territorial disputes end, and Vienna's vampire society doesn't tear itself apart in civil war. Not bad for 40 nights of work. Not bad at all. The final treaty was simpler than the marriage decree would have been, but more powerful. Ophelia transcribed it carefully, every letter precise, every clause clear. The language they'd negotiated over 40 nights was solid, enforceable, based on actual mutual interest rather than symbolic gestures or hierarchy. On night 40, the court assembled for the signing. The treaty was laid out on the same table where Ophelia had spilled ink so many nights before. This time, her hands were steady. This time, she was vampire, not mortal. This time, everything had changed. Soren signed first, his signature bold and confident. Lord Corvus signed second, his hand trembling slightly with suppressed emotion. Lady Isolde signed as heir to House Corvus and newest member of the Vienna Council. Lady Severin signed as primary witness. The neutral arbiters added their marks. And finally, Ophelia signed. Court scribe, the title read, a new position created specifically for her. As scribe, she was a signatory, which gave her official standing in vampire law. She was no longer just a calligrapher or a political advisor or Soren's pet mortal. She was part of the governmental structure, her role recognized and legitimized. The ink dried. The treaty was bound. 40 nights of negotiation, chaos, and transformation culminated in a document that would last centuries. The court celebrated with typical vampire extravagance. Blood wine, music, elaborate rituals Ophelia was still learning. She stood beside Soren and watched vampires from both houses mingle, old enemies finding tentative common ground. You did it, Lady Isolde said, appearing at her elbow. Destroyed a marriage, negotiated a better treaty, and became vampire in the process. That's impressive, even by our standards. I spilled ink and everything spiraled from there, Ophelia said. You saw the problems everyone else was ignoring and had the courage to point them out. That's not spiraling. That's leadership. Lady Isolde raised her glass. Welcome to immortality, Miss Hartley. Try not to let it bore you. She drifted away, and Soren took her place. Tired? He asked. Overwhelmed. Everything still feels too much. It will for a few months. The adjustment period is longer than people expect. He touched her face gently. But you'll adapt. Become remarkable in new ways. I was thinking, Ophelia said. The treaty is signed. The decree is finished. Our excuse to work together is over. Is it? Because you're court scribe now. That's a permanent position. Permanent. I'm still getting used to that word meaning something different. You have time to get used to it. Centuries, in fact. He pulled her close, and they swayed to music older than most countries. What do you want, Ophelia? Now that you have forever instead of 40 nights? She thought about it. About the ink room she could organize however she wanted. The documents she could preserve and create. The political structures she could help shape. About the vampire she loved who'd bought her time when time was what she most needed. About the strange new body and its strange new capabilities and the strange new future that stretched out indefinitely. I want to see how this works, she said finally. The treaty, us, all of it. I want to write the next 40 treaties and the 40 after that. I want to learn proper vampire politics instead of stumbling through them. I want to catalog every ink recipe in existence and invent new ones. I want to drive you crazy with questions about laws from centuries I wasn't alive for. She paused. I want the betting book. I want to see who won the 40 nights pool. He laughed, the sound surprised and genuine. The betting book? Mrs. Ashford had 11-to-1 odds I'd be fired within a week. I want to know how that paid out. You're incorrigible. I'm immortal. I can afford to be incorrigible for the next few centuries. He kissed her, there in the middle of the celebration, and the court pretended not to notice even though everyone absolutely noticed. When they broke apart, his expression was complicated happiness and fear and hope tangled together. I'm going to disappoint you sometimes, he said. Be too old-fashioned, too set in my ways, too used to being alone. I'm going to frustrate you constantly, she countered. Be too curious, too questioning, too enthusiastic about reorganizing things that worked perfectly well for the last 300 years. Perfect. Terrible. Probably both. He rested his forehead against hers. 40 nights became forever. That shouldn't work, but I think it might. Ask me in 40 years. I will, and 40 years after that. And 40 after that. He smiled. That's the advantage of immortal relationships. You get to keep asking. They danced until dawn threatened Ophelia's first dawn as vampire, the sun she'd have to avoid for the rest of her very long life. She felt a pang of loss for daylight, for morning coffee, for all the small human things she'd given up. But she also felt anticipation for the very long evening ahead, and all the evenings after that, for treaties to write, and inks to brew, and a vampire king to love and argue with and gradually figure out how to be immortal alongside. 40 nights ago, she'd spilled ink across a marriage decree and thought her life was over. Instead, she'd started a new one stranger, longer, more complicated than anything she'd imagined. But standing there in Soren's arms as the first dawn approached, Ophelia thought maybe it was the right complication after all. The betting book, when Mrs. Ashford finally showed it to her, revealed that nobody had predicted the actual outcome. Nobody had 11-to-1 odds on court calligrapher destroys marriage decree, negotiates better treaty, becomes vampire, and ends up court scribe to the king. The closest bet was from one of the younger vampires who'd wagered £5 on something entertaining happens. They collected handsomely. I suppose entertaining is one way to describe it, Ophelia said, reading through the entries. Understatement, Mrs. Ashford said. You turned the entire court upside down in 40 nights. I spilled ink. You did considerably more than that, dear girl. The older mortal woman, Ophelia realized with a start, since they were technically peers now in terms of mortality, smiled. But the ink spill is what we'll put in the histories. The ink spill that changed vampire Vienna. Has a nice ring to it. Soren found them in the kitchen, Ophelia reading the betting book and laughing. You're not supposed to be amused by your own chaos, he said. Someone bet that I'd set the building on fire. I think destroying a treaty by accident is marginally better than arson. Marginally. He stole a page from the book, reading. I like this one. £10 that whatever happens, it's more interesting than the marriage would have been. You won that bet by existing, Mrs. Ashford said to Ophelia. Congratulations. You're more interesting than a political marriage between ancient vampire houses. That's quite an achievement for someone who started as a calligrapher. I'm still a calligrapher, Ophelia protested. You're court scribe, the king's advisor, and a fledgling vampire with more political influence than most century-old house members. But sure, you're just a calligrapher. Mrs. Ashford patted her hand. Guard that humility, dear. You'll need it when the next crisis comes. There's going to be a next crisis? Always is in vampire politics. But you'll handle it. You've had excellent practice. She left them alone in the kitchen, and Soren pulled Ophelia close. Do you regret it? He asked, the question he'd been asking variations of for days. Any of it? She thought about the question seriously. Did she regret spilling the ink? No, it had revealed problems that needed addressing. Did she regret the negotiations? No. They'd built something better than what existed before. Did she regret being turned? That was more complicated. She'd given up daylight, given up aging and growing old and all the normal markers of a human life. But she'd gained time, gained power in a strange world, gained a love that might last centuries if they didn't drive each other insane first. Ask me in 40 years, she said, the answer they'd settled on. I'll add it to my calendar. He kissed her forehead. Come, the sun is fully up. You should rest first day as vampire. You'll need more sleep than you expect. And tonight there's a council meeting where Lady Isolde takes her seat officially. As court scribe, you'll need to attend. More vampire politics. Welcome to eternity. It's mostly meetings and paperwork, with occasional dramatic incidents involving spilled ink. They retreated to the lower levels where the sun couldn't reach, and Ophelia discovered that vampire sleep was different, deeper, stranger, less optional. She woke at sunset feeling restored, found clothing laid out for her in the new rooms she'd been assigned, dressed in the dark velvets that marked vampire status. The council meeting was formal, elaborate, and exactly as boring as Soren had warned. Lady Isolde was officially granted her seat. The treaty was read into the official record. Various minor disputes were brought before the council for arbitration. Ophelia took notes in 3 colors of ink, marking disputes, resolutions, and questions for follow-up. Afterward, Lady Isolde caught her in the corridor. "You looked bored in there. Is it always that tedious?" "Usually worse. At least tonight had the novelty of my first official votes." She smiled. "Thank you, by the way, for destroying my engagement. I'm considerably happier with a council seat than I would have been as a political wife. You're welcome, I think?" "Definitely welcome, though I suspect my father will never forgive you. Lord Corvus and I can have a mutual loathing for the next few centuries. I'm fine with that." "Good. Because vampire grudges last a very long time, and you've just ensured you'll feature prominently in House Corvus stories as the mortal-turned-vampire who destroyed their dynastic ambitions." Lady Isolde's expression softened. "But you also helped House Corvus gain what it actually needed instead of what my father wanted. Eventually, people will recognize that. Just give it a century or two. I have time now." "That you do." She glanced down the corridor where Soren was talking with Lady Severin. "He's happy, you know. Happier than I've seen him in a very long time. Don't take that lightly." "I don't." "Good. Because you're permanent now. To him, to House Hael, to all of us. That permanence comes with responsibilities." "I'm starting to understand that." "You will, eventually." Lady Isolde walked away, leaving Ophelia to contemplate the weight of permanent and eventually in a life that now stretched out indefinitely. The days, nights really found their rhythm. Ophelia worked in her ink room, now elevated to an official scriptorium with proper funding and assistance. She attended council meetings, taking notes and occasionally offering observations that cut through centuries of accumulated grudge. She learned vampire politics, vampire history, vampire law. She practiced her new strength and speed in the training rooms, discovering the limits of her transformed body. And she spent time with Soren. Sometimes working, reviewing documents and discussing governance, sometimes simply existing in the same space, reading while he handled correspondence, learning the comfortable silence that comes from not needing to fill every moment with words. "You're adapting well," he observed one night, watching her letter a particularly complex document. "Better than most fledglings. I had good training in precision. Calligraphy requires patience and control. Turns out, so does being vampire. Most fledglings struggle with the strength. You haven't broken anything in weeks." "I broke 3 quills yesterday." "Quills don't count. I mean people or furniture." He moved to look over her shoulder at her work. "This is beautiful. The illumination especially." She was adding decorative elements to a property transfer document not required, but the client had paid for elaborate presentation. Gold leaf and ultramarine, vermilion and vine patterns that wove through the text. "Thank you. It's traditional designs but with some newer influences. The Vienna court style mixed with some Ottoman elements I've been researching." "How did you learn Ottoman illumination?" "There's a library in Istanbul that allowed me access to their historical documents. I've been corresponding with their archivists." He laughed. "Of course you have. A month as vampire and you're already networking across Europe." 2 months, and networking is too strong a word. I asked questions, they answered. I shared some recipes for oak gall ink preparation. They shared some techniques for gold leaf application. It's collaborative work. It's impressive work. He kissed the top of her head. "You're building something here. A reputation, a body of knowledge. In a few decades, you'll be one of the premier scribes in vampire society. If I don't get bored and decide to do something completely different, will you?" She considered it. "I don't think so. I like this, the precision, the beauty, the way documents matter. Treaties and contracts and histories, all preserved in ink that lasts centuries. It feels important. It is important, more than people usually recognize." He pulled up a chair beside her. "Can I tell you something?" Always. The night you spilled ink on the marriage decree, I was looking for any reason not to sign it, any excuse, any delay. I'd resigned myself to going through with it because the alternative seemed worse, and then you knocked over the ink pot, and I had my excuse. He paused. I've spent 2 months wondering if I somehow unconsciously influenced that moment, if I wanted it to happen so badly that I created circumstances that made it more likely. You think you magically made me clumsy? I think I might have called Mrs. Ashford at exactly the wrong moment, startled you while you were reaching for something, created the accident I wanted. Ophelia set down her brush. Soren, I knocked over ink because I misjudged the distance and I'm not very spatially coordinated. That's not magic or fate or manipulation. That's just me being human, being mortal at the time and making a clumsy mistake. You're sure? I'm sure you're giving yourself too much credit for my accident. She turned in her chair to face him properly. But even if you did somehow contribute to the circumstances, so what? The ink spill revealed real problems with the decree. The negotiations that followed built something better. Would you rather have signed a terrible treaty and been trapped in a political marriage for centuries? No. Then the cause doesn't matter as much as the outcome. She took his hand. Stop feeling guilty about being relieved. The decree was terrible. The marriage would have been miserable for everyone involved, and we found a better solution. Let it be a happy accident instead of a source of angst. He smiled, the expression softening his austere features. When did you become so practical? I was always practical. You were just too busy being 300 years old and dramatic to notice. I'm not dramatic. You literally said, guard your heart to me within the first week of negotiations. That was justified caution. That was vampire drama. She returned to her illumination work, adding tiny details to a flower pattern. But I like it. The drama, the intensity, the way you treat everything like it matters deeply. It's refreshing after years of mortal practicality. I'm refreshing now? Last week you told me I was insufferably old-fashioned. You are insufferably old-fashioned. You're also refreshing. Both can be true. He watched her work for a while in comfortable silence. Then, Ophelia, what do you want from this? From us? Long-term, I mean. She paused mid-stroke, considering. Honestly, I don't know yet. I'm 2 months into immortality. I'm still figuring out what being vampire means, what my role in the court is, what I'm capable of. Adding, what do I want from a centuries-long relationship to that list feels overwhelming. That's fair. But I know I like this. Working together, existing in the same space, building something that matters. Whether that eventually means formal binding or just continuing as we are, or something else entirely, ask me in 40 years. She completed the flower and started on the next. What do you want? Everything. Nothing. Both. He sighed. I want to not worry about losing you to mortal death. I want to see what you become over centuries. I want to fight about ink recipes and treaty language and whether my governance style is outdated. I want to not be alone in the way I've been alone for 300 years. That's not nothing. That's quite a lot, actually. Is it too much? Ask me in 40 years. She set down her brush and turned to kiss him properly. For now, it's enough to keep showing up and seeing what happens next. I can do that. Good. Now let me finish this illumination. The client is paying extra for the Ottoman influences, and I want to get the vine pattern exactly right. They settled back into comfortable silence, and Ophelia returned to her work. Outside, Vienna's vampire society continued its ancient patterns, centuries of grudges and alliances and politics playing out in councils and courts. Inside, a vampire king and his newly turned scribe built something newer and stranger, a relationship based on spilled ink and honest questions, and the slow discovery of what forever might actually mean. The 40 years Ophelia kept referencing came and went. She became recognized as one of the finest scribes in Europe, traveling to courts across the continent, preserving documents and brewing inks and training new calligraphers. Soren ruled Vienna with steady pragmatism, the treaty with House Corvus holding firm, the coven stable and prosperous. They fought sometimes about governance and tradition, and whether certain vampire laws made sense in the modern world. They reconciled in the ink room, over documents and tea, and gradually improving intimacy. They learned each other's patterns, accommodated each other's needs. built something that looked more like partnership with every passing decade. On the 40th anniversary of the ink spill, the court held a celebration. Technically, it was celebrating the treaty, but everyone knew it was also commemorating the chaos that had preceded it. Someone had commissioned a painting of the original moment, Ophelia with her quill raised, ink spreading across the decree, the court frozen in shock. It hung now in the main hall, a reminder of how accidents sometimes led to better outcomes than plans. "That painting is deeply embarrassing," Ophelia said, studying it. "It's historical documentation," Soren countered. "Future generations should know how Vienna's most enduring treaty came about. Through clumsiness and panic. Through honest mistakes and willingness to find better solutions." He put his arm around her waist. "So, 40 years. Do you regret it yet?" She looked at the painting, at the celebration around them, at the life they'd built. "No, not yet. Ask me in another 40 years. I will." And he did, 40 years later, when Ophelia had become not just court scribe, but a council member herself, one of the youngest vampires ever granted that status. And 40 years after that, when wars and plagues had tested Vienna's vampire society, but the treaty held firm. And 40 years after that, when new technologies transformed the world and vampire society adapted, sometimes gracefully, sometimes grudgingly. Each time, her answer was the same. "Not yet. Ask me again." Until finally, a century and a half after the ink spill, when Ophelia was no longer a fledgling by anyone's measure, when she'd lived longer as vampire than she had as mortal, when the modern world had become strange and exciting and full of possibilities, she was still discovering. Soren asked again, "Do you regret it?" And Ophelia, surrounded by centuries of accumulated experience and love and the continued joy of arguing about ink recipes with a vampire king, smiled and said, "No, I don't regret any of it. Not the spill, not the turning, not the fights or the compromises or the complicated, wonderful, strange life we've built. Ask me in another 100 years if you want, but I think my answer is settled now." "Good," Soren said, pulling her close, "because I was running out of ways to phrase the question. You could stop asking. Where's the drama in that?" She laughed, and they stood together in the scriptorium she'd built and expanded over the decades, surrounded by centuries of preserved documents and the ink that had started everything. And Ophelia thought that for an accident, spilling ink on a marriage decree had worked out remarkably well. The court continued around them, vampire politics playing out in familiar patterns. But in the ink room, in the quiet moments between treaties and councils and the weight of immortality, a calligrapher and a king built something that lasted not because it was planned or inevitable, but because they'd chosen it repeatedly across decades and centuries. And somewhere in the archives, carefully preserved in acid-free storage, the original ruined marriage decree remained a testament to how sometimes the best outcomes come from spilling ink at exactly the right moment.